The bailiff's voice cracked through the courtroom like a hammer on glass. "Stand up!" Daniel Miller did not move fast enough. His knees locked. His hands stayed flat on the table, fingers spread, as if the wood might keep him from tipping over. Across the room, a woman he barely recognized anymore whispered something to her attorney and smiled. Not relief, not mercy. A smile sharpened by certainty. The judge hadn't even ruled yet, and somehow Daniel already knew he was losing. The camera would have started tight on his face, 45 years old, unshaven, eyes ringed dark from nights that ended too late and mornings that came too early. A man who looked exactly like the kind of father people assume is barely holding things together, because most days he was. 3 weeks earlier, the letter had arrived taped crookedly to his apartment door, the envelope already soft from rain. Final custody hearing. No continuances, no delays. If he failed to prove stability, his 7-year-old daughter Hannah would be moved to her mother's address 2 counties away. A better school district, a larger house, a quieter life. On paper. The judge cleared his throat. Daniel swallowed. The sound echoed too loudly in his head, mixing with another sound he could never escape. Hannah's voice the night before, half asleep, asking if she should start packing her toys just in case. That was the hook that dragged him under. Not the law, not the lawyers. The fact that his daughter had already begun preparing for goodbye, cut back in time. The garage smelled like oil and burnt rubber, the way it always did when the bay doors were left open too long. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag that had once been white and glanced at the clock bolted crookedly above the tool bench. 6:47 in the evening. He was already late for his second job. Danny called Frank the shop owner, voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes he swore he'd quit. "You good to close up?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, got it." Frank watched him for a second longer than necessary. "Court coming up, not a question." Daniel didn't look up. "Yeah." Frank exhaled. "You need anything?" Daniel shook his head too fast. Pride was cheaper than help. He pulled on his jacket thin at the elbows and stepped outside into a sky already bruised purple. Rain was coming. You could smell it. By the time he reached the highway, the storm had arrived early and angry. Rain slammed the windshield in heavy sheets, the wipers struggling to keep up. The road narrowed where construction had stalled months ago, orange barrels glowing like warning flares. Daniel leaned forward, knuckles white on the steering wheel. That's when he saw them. 2 figures on the shoulder. One umbrella flipped inside out. A sleek sedan, angled wrong hazard lights blinking like a heartbeat about to give out. 2 young women, identical faces, hair, plastered to their cheeks, soaked through coats that clearly had never been meant for weather like this. Daniel slowed, kept slowing. The voice in his head rose immediately sharp and practical. "You don't have time. You can't afford trouble. You're already late." He drove past them. The car made it another 100 yards before he hit the brakes. The camera would have cut to his rearview mirror. The twins growing smaller behind him. One of them slipping on the wet gravel, catching herself just in time. Daniel shut his eyes. Just for a second. Then he pulled over. When he stepped out of the car, the rain hit him like punishment. Cold, relentless. One of the girls looked up, eyes wide, startled, like she'd been expecting another set of taillights disappearing into the dark. "Are you okay?" Daniel shouted, his voice nearly lost to thunder. The girl nodded too quickly. The other shook her head. They spoke at the same time, voices tripping over each other. "Dead battery. No signal. Been there almost an hour." Daniel crouched by the hood, rain soaking through his jacket fingers, moving by instinct. Corrosion. Loose terminal. Simple. Fixable. He straightened slowly. "I can't get you going tonight," he said. "But I can get you somewhere safe." They hesitated. A flicker of something passed between them. Not fear. Calculation. Then one of them nodded. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way people rarely do anymore. Inside Daniel's car, the air smelled like old coffee and motor oil. The twins sat stiffly at first, then relaxed as the miles passed. One of them laughed softly when the radio cut out and came back wrong. The other watched the road eyes reflective. "You have kids?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. "A daughter. How old? 7. Another pause. Then quieter. "She's lucky." Daniel almost smiled. Almost. When he dropped them at the motel, they thanked him again. One reached into her purse, then stopped herself when she saw his face. The rain had eased, but his exhaustion hadn't. "You remind me of someone," the other twin said, frowning slightly, as if the thought bothered her. Daniel shrugged. "I'm just a guy who didn't keep driving." They watched him leave. Neither noticed the dent in his rear bumper or the way his shoulders sagged as soon as he was alone again. Back in the present, the courtroom air felt stale, recycled too many times. Daniel stood now because the bailiff was staring at him. The judge adjusted his glasses. A man in his late 50s, posture rigid, expression unreadable. Daniel lifted his eyes. Just long enough. For half a second, something flickered across the judge's face. Not recognition. Not yet. Something closer to curiosity. As if Daniel were a loose thread he hadn't expected to see today. Somewhere in the gallery a chair creaked. The judge's gavel hovered, and Daniel Miller, poor, tired, underestimated. Daniel Miller had no idea that the storm he thought he'd survived was only the beginning. The judge did not look at Daniel when he spoke. "Mr. Miller, you may be seated." The words landed without warmth, without judgment, and somehow that made them heavier. Daniel lowered himself back into the chair wood, creaking under his weight. He felt every eye in the room, measuring him, filing him away into a familiar category. Blue collar, overworked, temporary. Rebecca sat 2 tables away, posture, straight hands, folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was brushed smooth, makeup careful but not excessive. She looked like someone who had rehearsed calm in front of a mirror. Her attorney leaned close, whispering something that made her nod once slowly. She did not look at Daniel. She had not looked at him once since the hearing began. The camera would have pulled back now wide shot. The flags behind the bench. The seal on the wall. The quiet machinery of a system that did not care how much Daniel loved his daughter, only whether that love came with square footage and steady income. The judge cleared his throat. "We'll begin with opening statements." Rebecca's attorney stood first. His suit fit too well. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had said the same words in the same room dozens of times. He spoke of opportunity, of structure, of a mother who had recently secured a promising job offer in a neighboring county, of a school district ranked higher than average, of concerns about long hours, inconsistent schedules, and a child spending too much time with neighbors and babysitters. Daniel listened, jaw tight. None of it was a lie. That was the worst part. When it was his turn, his public defender stood, shuffled papers, and spoke more softly. He talked about presence, about a father who never missed a parent-teacher meeting, about a child who walked to school holding her father's hand every morning, about a man doing everything he could with what he had. The judge nodded, taking notes, still not looking at Daniel. As the hearing moved forward, witnesses were called. Hannah's teacher spoke kindly, describing a little girl who was attentive, creative, sometimes tired, but always eager to please. A neighbor testified that Daniel's apartment lights were on early every morning, that he waved every Sunday when he took Hannah to the park. Rebecca's sister spoke next. Her voice trembled as she described concern, not accusation. She said Rebecca worried constantly. She said Rebecca wanted stability, not victory. She said Rebecca loved her daughter. Daniel believed her. That truth sat uncomfortably in his chest. Then there was a pause. Papers rustled. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. For the first time since the hearing began, he lifted his gaze and looked directly at Daniel. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't kind. It was assessing. "Mr. Miller, the judge said you work 2 jobs. "Yes, Your Honor, and you have been doing so since the divorce." "Yes, sir." "How many hours a week?" Daniel hesitated. Numbers always sounded worse out loud. "It depends." 60, sometimes more. A murmur moved through the room. The judge's pen paused. "And who watches your daughter during those hours?" Daniel swallowed. "Mrs. Carson from next door? Sometimes my friend Mark when his shift lines up. I pay them when I can." The judge nodded once. "And if awarded primary custody, do you plan to change your schedule?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. The honest answer was complicated. He could not promise what he did not yet have the power to change. "I'm trying," he said finally. "I've applied for day shifts. I'm waiting to hear back." The judge's eyes flicked briefly to the file in front of him. Something unreadable crossed his face. There it was again. That feeling. Like Daniel had stepped into a room mid-conversation, the judge looked down. "We'll take a brief recess." The gavel struck. The sound echoed sharper than before. Daniel remained seated as people stood around him. His attorney leaned in. "That wasn't bad," he whispered. "Could have gone worse." Daniel nodded, but his attention had drifted. He watched the judge rise and exit through the side door robe, swaying slightly as he walked. Just before disappearing, the man paused, hand on the frame, and glanced back into the courtroom. His eyes passed over Rebecca, over the attorneys. Then for a split second, they stopped on Daniel. The look was not professional. It was personal. Daniel's stomach dropped. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the air buzzed with quiet conversations and nervous pacing. Daniel stood alone by a vending machine that hummed louder than necessary. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cool metal, breathing in through his nose, out through his mouth. He thought of Hannah's backpack by the door, the way she lined her shoes up at night without being asked, the questions she didn't say out loud. "Mr. Miller." Daniel straightened. A bailiff stood a few feet away, expression neutral. "The judge would like a word." Rebecca's attorney looked up sharply. "Excuse me, just Mr. Miller?" the bailiff repeated. Daniel's attorney grabbed his sleeve. "Be careful," he murmured. "Answer what's asked, nothing more." Daniel followed the bailiff down a narrow hallway, past framed photos of former judges, all stern faces and dated haircuts. The judge's chambers smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The judge stood by the window, back turned. The city stretched beyond the glass gray and wet from the storm that had passed. "Sit," the judge said, still not turning around. Daniel sat. His heart beat loud in his ears. The judge finally faced him. Up close, he looked older than he had from the bench, lines at the eyes. A weariness that did not belong to someone in control of so many decisions. "I want to be very clear," the judge said. "This conversation does not concern the merits of your case." Daniel nodded. "I am stepping aside from this hearing." Daniel blinked. "Your Honor." "There is a potential conflict," the judge said evenly. "I've filed the necessary paperwork. Another judge will continue." Relief flared, then confusion. "I don't understand." The judge studied him for a moment longer. Then quietly, 3 nights ago, 2 young women were stranded on Route 87 during a severe storm. Daniel's breath caught. "They were my daughters," the judge continued. "They told me about a man who stopped when no one else did. They told me about his daughter, about a custody hearing." The room seemed to tilt. "I did not connect the name until this morning," the judge said. "When I did, I realized I could not preside over your case, not without raising questions that would undermine the process." Daniel stared at him, words failing. The judge held up a hand. This does not mean your case improves or worsens because of what you did. That is not how the law works. He paused. His voice softened just slightly. But character matters, and sometimes it shows up in places the law does not measure. Daniel stood slowly, unsure if he should speak. I didn't help them because of who you are, he said. I didn't know. I know, the judge replied. That's why it matters. The judge opened the door. You should return to the courtroom. As Daniel stepped back into the hallway, his legs felt unsteady. Behind him, the door closed with a quiet click. The storm outside had passed. The one inside him had not. The new judge arrived without ceremony. No dramatic pause, no lingering looks, just a different robe, a different face, and the same seal on the wall that reminded everyone the system moved on whether you were ready or not. Judge Karen Holloway was smaller than the man she replaced, mid-50s, sharp eyes behind thin frames, hair pulled back tight enough to suggest she didn't tolerate wasted time or wasted words. She scanned the room once, brisk and efficient, then nodded to the bailiff. Let's continue. Daniel sat straighter than he had all morning. Not from confidence, from instinct. The kind that told him every second now mattered more than anything he owned. Rebecca shifted in her chair. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Her attorney leaned close, whispering, fast fingers tapping the table. She nodded again, but this time her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Judge Holloway adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file. Before we proceed, I want to clarify the record, she said. This case includes several social service reports and school evaluations that were referenced but not fully entered into evidence during prior hearings. She lifted her eyes. That will change today. The room went still. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't known about those reports. He only knew the visits, the questions, the polite strangers who watched how Hannah played and how he spoke to her, writing notes on clipboards without explanation. Rebecca's attorney stood. Your Honor, those documents were deemed supplementary, by whom Judge Holloway interrupted. A pause. Too long. By counsel, he said carefully. Judge Holloway's expression did not change. Then counsel made an error. She turned to the clerk. I want the full reports entered into the record. Papers were passed. The sound of staples clicking echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. Daniel exhaled slowly, careful not to let hope rise too fast. Hope had a way of making disappointment hurt more. The first report was read aloud. A social worker's assessment from the previous year. It described a modest apartment kept clean. A child with routines. A father who asked questions, took notes, followed instructions. No signs of neglect. No safety concerns. Rebecca stared straight ahead. The second report came from Hannah's school counselor. It spoke of attachment, of a child who sought reassurance but displayed resilience, of a strong bond with her father. It also noted anxiety surrounding transitions and uncertainty. Daniel's throat tightened. Then came the third document, older, filed shortly after the divorce. It described Rebecca's voluntary request for counseling following what was termed acute emotional distress. It did not accuse. It did not condemn. It simply stated facts: missed work, insomnia, panic episodes, a recommendation for continued support that had never been followed up. Rebecca's attorney stood again. Your Honor, this information is outdated. Judge Holloway nodded. So are many of the concerns raised about Mr. Miller's finances. Her gaze shifted to Daniel. Yet they were considered relevant. Silence. Rebecca's eyes finally moved to Daniel. There was no anger in them, just something raw and exposed. Regret, maybe, or fear. Judge Holloway leaned back. I want to be clear. This is not a trial to determine who is the better parent. It is a determination of what serves the child's best interest at this time. She folded her hands. And sometimes that answer is not perfect. It is simply the least harmful. The words hung heavy. Rebecca stood slowly. "May I speak?" she asked, voice quiet but steady. Her attorney hesitated, then nodded. Rebecca turned toward the judge, then toward Daniel. Her voice wavered only once. "I didn't come here to take Hannah away from her father," she said. "I came because I'm scared." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "I'm scared that love isn't enough," she continued, "that wanting something badly doesn't make it possible. I grew up watching my parents struggle. I promised myself my child would never have to." Her hands clenched. "When I look at Daniel, I don't see a bad father. I see someone exhausted, and I'm afraid one day that exhaustion will break him." Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He understood that fear too well. Judge Holloway listened without interruption. When Rebecca finished, the judge nodded once. "Thank you for your honesty." She turned to Daniel. "Mr. Miller, is there anything you wish to add?" Daniel stood. His legs felt heavy, but his voice was steady. "I can't promise Hannah a big house," he said. "I can't promise her everything will be easy. But I can promise I'll show up. Every day. Even when I'm tired. Especially when I'm tired." He paused. "If loving her isn't enough, then I don't know what is." Judge Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed the file. "This court finds that immediate removal from the primary caregiver would cause unnecessary emotional harm," she said. "Primary custody will remain with Mr. Miller. Miss Miller will retain expanded visitation with the expectation that both parties engage in cooperative planning and counseling support." The gavel came down. Solid. Final. Daniel didn't move. Not at first. The words took time to reach his body. Rebecca covered her mouth with her hand. Tears slid down her cheeks unchecked. Daniel stepped toward her instinctive, then stopped unsure. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. A silent acknowledgement. Not surrender. Acceptance. In the hallway afterward, Daniel leaned against the wall, breath shaking as the adrenaline drained away. His attorney clapped him on the shoulder, murmuring congratulations he barely heard. Across the room, Judge Whitman stood near a window, no longer wearing his robe. He met Daniel's eyes and inclined his head slightly. No smile, no words, just respect. Later that evening, Daniel unlocked his apartment door to the sound of laughter. Hannah sat cross-legged on the floor with Mrs. Carson coloring furiously. She looked up the moment he stepped inside. "Daddy?" she asked, eyes searching his face. Daniel dropped his keys and knelt. "You're staying," he said simply. She launched herself into his arms, gripping him like she was afraid the world might change its mind. That night, after Hannah fell asleep, Daniel stood by the window and looked out at the quiet street. The rain had washed everything clean. For the first time in a long while, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like work. And he was ready. Daniel woke before the alarm the way he always did after something big happened. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He lay still for a moment, staring at the faint water stain on the ceiling, listening to Hannah's soft breathing through the open bedroom door. The fear was gone, but the tension remained coiled tight under his ribs. Victory did not feel like relief yet. It felt like responsibility pressing closer. He rose carefully, showered in lukewarm water, and dressed for work. The mirror above the sink showed the same man as yesterday, but his eyes were different, sharper, awake. He made coffee black and bitter and poured a second mug he would not touch. When Hannah padded out in her socks, hair sticking up at odd angles, he knelt and hugged her without a word. She smelled like crayons and sleep. "You're early," she murmured. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Big day." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than he knew. She always did. By the time he dropped her at school, the sky had cleared into a pale blue that looked almost apologetic. He sat in the car for a moment after she disappeared inside, hands on the steering wheel, grounding himself. Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He let it ring once before answering. "Mr. Miller," a man's voice said, measured professional. "This is Jonathan Whitman." Daniel closed his eyes. "Yes, sir." "I won't take much of your time," Whitman continued. "I wanted to say that the court reached a sound decision yesterday." "Thank you," Daniel said. It felt insufficient. There was a pause. "My daughters would like to thank you as well. They've been persistent." A faint smile crept into the judge's voice. "They asked if you and your daughter might join us for dinner this weekend." Daniel hesitated. He thought of his worn jacket, his scuffed shoes, the quiet weight of not belonging. "That's generous," he said carefully. "It's not about generosity," Whitman replied. "It's about acknowledgement. Consider it optional." Daniel looked at the school doors. "We'd be honored." That evening, the garage was louder than usual. Air compressors hissed. Radios blared half-forgotten rock songs. Frank watched Daniel from across the bay, then tossed him a rag. "You're moving different," he said. "Like you won something." Daniel smiled thinly. "Something like that." Frank nodded. "Don't let it change you." Daniel wiped his hands. "I won't." On Saturday, he borrowed a tie from Frank and ironed his only decent shirt until the collar lay flat. Hannah wore her yellow dress, the one with sunflowers. She twirled in front of the mirror, grinning. "Do I look fancy?" "You look perfect," Daniel said, and meant it. The Whitman house sat high on a hill, gated but not ostentatious. Stone steps led to a wide door that opened before they knocked. Claire and Megan stood there, identical smiles, identical posture, but different eyes. One warm, one searching. "You came," Claire said, pulling Hannah into a gentle hug. Megan crouched to Hannah's level. "We saved you dessert," she whispered conspiratorially. Inside, the house was filled with light and quiet confidence. Family photos lined the walls. The judge appeared from the hallway in jeans and a sweater, older and softer than he had looked on the bench. He shook Daniel's hand firmly. "Welcome." Dinner was simple. Roast chicken. Vegetables. Conversation that flowed without effort. Hannah laughed more than Daniel had heard in weeks. At one point she tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, they have a piano." After dinner, he said, smiling. Later, as the girls played, Whitman led Daniel onto the patio. The city lights stretched below them, distant and calm. "My daughters told me something the judge said. They said I taught them how to succeed, but not how to feel safe." Daniel nodded slowly. "I spent my life thinking provision was the same as presence." Whitman continued. "You disabused me of that notion." Daniel shifted, uncomfortable with praise. "I just did what I hoped someone would do for my kid." Whitman looked at him. "That's exactly the point." When Daniel drove home that night, Hannah asleep in the back seat, the road felt different, wider, possible. 3 weeks passed. The routine settled into something almost peaceful. Then the letter came. It was from Rebecca. Daniel read it twice before sitting down. She wrote about therapy, about trying to rebuild, about wanting to do right by Hannah without tearing her world apart. At the end, she asked for a conversation, not about custody, about cooperation. Daniel stared at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. They met at a diner halfway between their neighborhoods. Rebecca looked tired, honest tired. She stirred her coffee without drinking it. "I was angry," she said. "At you, at myself, at the way things turned out." Daniel listened. He did not interrupt. "I don't want to be her enemy," Rebecca said finally. "I want to be her mother." Daniel nodded. "Then let's figure it out." That night, as he tucked Hannah in, she asked, "Mommy's okay, right?" "She's trying," Daniel said. Like we all are. Weeks turned into months. The garage promoted Daniel to lead mechanic on day shift, not because of luck, because he asked, because he showed up. Hannah flourished, laughed easier, slept better. And yet something else stirred beneath the surface, a restlessness, as if the story wasn't finished. One afternoon, a black sedan pulled into the garage lot. A man in a tailored coat stepped out, scanning the space with quiet authority. He asked for Daniel by name. Frank raised an eyebrow. The man extended his hand. "I represent a private foundation," he said. "We're conducting a review. Your name came up." Daniel wiped grease from his hands. "For what?" The man smiled slightly. "For the way you handle pressure." The storm was not over. It was only changing shape. The man did not introduce himself right away. He walked the length of the garage slowly, eyes tracking every detail, the oil-stained concrete, the mismatched tool chests, the way Daniel finished tightening a bolt before wiping his hands. When he finally stopped in front of him, the noise of the shop seemed to drop a level, as if the space itself had noticed. "My name is Robert Hale," the man said. "I work with a private family foundation based in Chicago." Daniel nodded once. "What does that have to do with me?" Hale smiled, thin and deliberate. "That depends on how much you remember about a rainstorm on Route 87. Daniel stiffened just slightly. Frank noticed. Everyone noticed. Hale continued as if he hadn't. "The foundation evaluates individuals who demonstrate decision-making under stress. Not resumes, not credit scores. Character." He gestured around them. "Your employer spoke highly of you. So did several people who didn't know you were being asked." Daniel crossed his arms. "I'm not looking for charity," Good Hale said. "We don't give it." They sat in Frank's cramped office, the walls lined with faded certificates and a calendar 3 months out of date. Hale slid a thin folder across the desk. Inside were notes, dates, locations, small moments Daniel barely remembered. Helping a stranded motorist years ago. Covering a shift for a coworker without asking for overtime. A complaint he filed once about unsafe equipment quietly without drama. "You've been watched," Hale said. "Not closely. Just enough." Daniel pushed the folder back. Why Hale leaned back? Because the foundation funds community infrastructure projects that require local oversight. People who won't look away when things get uncomfortable. Daniel let out a short laugh. "You've got the wrong guy." Hale's eyes sharpened. "You stopped in a storm when everyone else kept driving." Silence settled between them. "What are you offering?" Daniel asked. "A temporary consulting role," Hale replied. "Paid. Flexible. No public announcement. You'd review operations at several facilities. Report inconsistencies. Risks. You'd be surprised how many decisions are made assuming no one is paying attention." Daniel thought of Hannah, of school drop-offs, of dinner routines finally forming. "I can't leave town," he said. "You wouldn't," Hale replied. "Most of the work is local and discreet." Daniel stood. "I need time." Hale rose as well. "Of course." He handed Daniel a card. "No title, just a number. We'll wait." That night, Daniel didn't sleep much. He lay on the couch staring at the ceiling while Hannah slept in her room, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The offer felt unreal and dangerous. He'd spent years keeping his head down. Now someone was asking him to look up. The next morning, he called Judge Whitman. They met for coffee at a small shop near the courthouse. Whitman arrived without ceremony, no entourage, no robe, just a man with tired eyes and careful posture. "I was hoping you'd call," Whitman said. Daniel slid Hale's card across the table. "Do you know him?" Whitman glanced at it, then nodded. "The foundation's been around a long time, quietly influential. Why me? Whitman took a sip of coffee. Because you don't confuse power with noise. Daniel frowned. That doesn't answer the question. Whitman set the cup down. I've spent decades watching people perform integrity when it benefits them. Very few live it when it costs them something. Daniel absorbed that. What would you do? Whitman met his gaze. I would listen, carefully, and decide what kind of example I wanted my daughter to grow up seeing. That evening, Daniel accepted. The first assignment came faster than he expected. A logistics facility on the edge of town, publicly funded, privately operated. Daniel visited under the guise of routine maintenance consultation. He wore his usual jacket, asked simple questions, took notes. People spoke freely to him because they assumed he didn't matter. That was the advantage. He noticed discrepancies. Safety reports signed but not enforced. Equipment repairs delayed to meet quotas. A supervisor who cut corners and laughed about it. Daniel documented everything. Calmly, precisely. 2 weeks later, the supervisor was gone. Quietly reassigned. No scandal, no headlines. The pattern repeated. Nursing home supply contracts, school bus maintenance schedules, places where the vulnerable depended on systems that assumed compliance without accountability. Daniel never raised his voice, never threatened. He asked questions until answers collapsed under their own weight. At home, Hannah noticed the change. You're home more, she said one night, spooning cereal into her mouth. Different work, Daniel replied. Better? He considered it. More honest. One afternoon, Claire called. Dad says you're making waves. Daniel smiled faintly. Not trying to. That's usually when it happens, she said. We're proud of you. The real shift came 3 months in. Hale requested a meeting. Not at the garage, not at the courthouse. At a boardroom downtown Daniel had only ever passed from the sidewalk. The room was glass and steel. The city spread below like a map of moving parts. Hale stood at the window when Daniel entered. You've done well, Hale said. Which brings us to the next step. Daniel didn't sit. I'm not interested in climbing anything. Hale turned. Good. Because this isn't about climbing. It's about leverage. He slid a document forward. Names, numbers, a corporate subsidiary Daniel recognized, the same company that managed the logistics facility and the nursing home, and the bus fleet. They cut costs where no one looks, Hale said. Until someone does. Daniel read silently, his jaw tightened. We need someone to sit in the room when decisions are made. Hale continued. Someone they won't suspect. Daniel looked up. They'll suspect once I speak. Hale shook his head. Not if they think you're there by accident. Daniel leaned back, absorbing it. What happens when they realize I'm not? Hale smiled again. This time it reached his eyes. Then the room changes. Daniel left the building with the weight of it settling in. He wasn't a pawn. He was a variable. That night he stood in Hannah's doorway watching her sleep. The world felt larger now, more dangerous, but also more malleable than he'd ever been taught. He thought of the judge's words. Character shows up where the law does not measure. Daniel Miller had spent his life being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed as temporary. He was done being invisible. And somewhere in rooms far above his pay grade, people were about to learn what happened when the wrong man was ignored for too long. The boardroom smelled like polished wood and quiet confidence. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped inside, the way the air itself seemed trained not to react. 12 people sat around the table. None of them stood when he entered. A few glanced up, curious, already dismissing him. The badge clipped to his jacket said consultant. No last name. Perfect. He took the empty seat near the end, placed a legal pad in front of him, and waited. The man at the head of the table, a broad-shouldered executive with silver hair and a voice used to being obeyed, continued without acknowledging Daniel's presence. "We'll streamline the maintenance budget by another 10% this quarter," the executive said. "No operational impact. The numbers support it." Daniel's pen moved. He wrote nothing. He watched hands, micro-expressions, the way one woman hesitated before nodding, the way another man avoided eye contact. Fear traveled quietly in rooms like this. A slide appeared on the screen. Charts, percentages, forecasts, everything clean, everything distant. Daniel cleared his throat. The sound cut sharper than expected. 12 heads turned. The executive frowned slightly, not irritated, just confused. "Yes." Daniel kept his voice level. "Which maintenance budget?" A pause. The executive smiled thinly. "Facilities." "All facilities?" Daniel asked. "Of course." Daniel nodded as if satisfied. Then he flipped his legal pad around and slid it down the table. On the page were 3 dates, 2 locations, and a line item circled twice. "Then you should expect the North Loading Bay to fail inspection within 6 weeks, Daniel said. The report was signed off, but the repair was never completed. The load-bearing stress is already past tolerance. Silence. The woman who had hesitated earlier straightened. "That's not accurate." Daniel met her eyes. "It is. I stood under it. I heard the metal shift." The executive leaned forward. "And who are you?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Someone who doesn't get paid to ignore sounds." The meeting ended 10 minutes early. In the hallway, Robert Hale waited arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You weren't supposed to speak." Daniel walked past him. "Then you shouldn't have put me in the room." Hale followed. "They'll start asking questions." "They should," Daniel replied. "If they don't, you're wasting my time." At home that night, Hannah sat at the kitchen table doing homework, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Daniel watched her from the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, grounding himself in the ordinary. She looked up. "You're quiet." "Just thinking," he said. "About work?" He nodded. "Is it scary?" He considered the truth. "Sometimes." She accepted that. "It's okay to be scared. Mrs. Carson says brave people still get scared." Daniel smiled. "She's right." The next week moved fast. Too fast. Calls came late. Meetings shifted. Names Daniel recognized from reports suddenly appeared in his email inbox, CC'd on threads that did not include him yesterday. He was no longer invisible. He was an inconvenience. Then the message arrived without warning. Subject: emergency session. The location was different this time. Smaller. No windows. The executive with silver hair was gone. Replaced by a younger man with restless energy and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've reviewed your findings," the man said, "and we believe there's been a misunderstanding." Daniel sat back. "There hasn't." The man's jaw tightened. "You're overstepping." Daniel folded his hands. "I was invited." A chuckle from the far end of the table. A man with cufflinks shaped like anchors leaned forward. "You're a mechanic, right?" Daniel met his gaze. "Among other things." "You don't belong in this conversation." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "That's what makes it useful." The man scoffed. "You think you're some kind of watchdog?" Daniel leaned in just slightly. "No, I think I'm the guy who reads what gets buried." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone exhaled sharply. Afterward, Hale caught up with him in the stairwell. "They're pushing back." "They always do," Daniel said. "You're exposed." Daniel stopped on the landing and turned. "Then stop pretending this is discreet." Hale studied him for a long moment. "You're not afraid of losing this?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm afraid of keeping it quiet." That night, the call came from Judge Whitman. They reached out, Whitman said without preamble. Asked if I knew you. Daniel closed his eyes. What did you say? The truth, Whitman replied. That I recused myself when it mattered. That you acted without knowing who I was. That you don't trade favors. A pause. They didn't like that. Daniel leaned against the counter. Neither do I. Whitman's voice softened. Be careful. Daniel looked at Hannah's drawing taped to the fridge. Stick figures. A sun too big for the page. I am. The turning point came on a Thursday. Daniel arrived at the facility to find the gates locked and a security guard he didn't recognize blocking the entrance. Access revoked, the guard said. Daniel nodded. I'll wait. He sat in his car for 2 hours, then 3. At noon, a black sedan pulled up behind him. The window lowered. Hale's face appeared tight. They're trying to freeze you out, Hale said. The board voted. Daniel stepped out into the heat. Then it's time. For what Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim folder Hale had never seen. For the part you didn't plan. Hale stared. What's that? Daniel met his eyes. I didn't just document failures. I traced incentives. Inside the folder were copies, emails, bonus structures tied to cost reductions, signatures, patterns, the quiet architecture of negligence. You went off script, Hale said, awe and fear mixing in his voice. Daniel nodded. I grew up off script. By Monday morning, the foundation released a statement. Not public, internal. A review expanded. External auditors brought in. The board chair resigned by Wednesday. No headlines, no applause, just movement. At home, Daniel cooked dinner while Hannah set the table. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number. This is the governor's office, a woman said calmly. We'd like to speak with Mr. Miller. Daniel turned down the stove. About what? About your recent work. He looked at Hannah, then at the quiet kitchen, the ordinary life he'd fought so hard to protect. I'm listening, he said. And for the first time, the power in the room was his. The governor's office did not look like power the way Daniel expected. No marble floors, no flags lining the hallway, just beige walls, low voices, and a receptionist who smiled politely without curiosity. Power, he was learning, preferred not to announce itself. They seated him in a small conference room with a pitcher of water and a legal pad already placed at his spot. The woman who entered a moment later introduced herself as Deputy Chief of Staff Eleanor Brooks. Late 50s, calm eyes, the kind of posture that suggested she had spent years listening to people lie without reacting. Mr. Miller, she said, sitting across from him. Thank you for coming. Daniel nodded. You said you wanted to talk about my work. Yes. She folded her hands. Specifically how a mechanic from a town most people can't find on a map managed to uncover a pattern of misconduct that our own auditors missed for years. Daniel didn't smile. They weren't looking in the same places. Brooks studied him. Explain. Daniel leaned back. They look at reports. I look at consequences. When equipment fails, someone gets hurt. When schedules get cut, corners get cut. When incentives reward silence, silence becomes policy. A pause. Brooks glanced at the legal pad, then back at him. You realize what you disrupted? Yes. And you're comfortable with that? No, Daniel said, but I'm responsible for it. That answer landed. He could see it in the way her shoulders eased just slightly. You didn't come through the usual channels, she said. You weren't appointed. You weren't elected. I was invited into rooms, Daniel replied. I didn't ask who owned them. Brooks smiled faintly. That's exactly what concerns some people. Daniel met her gaze. It should. She let the silence stretch. Then she slid a folder across the table, thicker than Hale's had been. He didn't open it yet. "We're forming a temporary oversight task force," she said. "Limited mandate. Infrastructure accountability. Quiet. Effective. We need someone who understands operations at ground level and isn't impressed by titles." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I have a daughter." Brooks nodded. "We've reviewed your case." That caught him off guard. Not fear. Recognition. "She's stable," Brooks continued. "Thriving. Your schedule matters." Daniel finally opened the folder. Inside were names he recognized. Agencies, regions, problems that looked familiar, now almost predictable. "You'd report directly to my office," Brooks said. "No press, no speeches. You'd be insulated." Daniel closed the folder. "Until I'm not." Brooks didn't argue. "Until you're not." He stood. "I need boundaries. Name them. I don't lie. I don't trade silence for access. And if someone tries to make this political, I walk." Brooks stood as well. "That's acceptable." Daniel paused at the door. "Why me?" She answered without hesitation. "Because you don't confuse obedience with loyalty." Outside, the city felt louder than before. Traffic, sirens, movement. Daniel sat in his car for a long moment before starting the engine. He thought of Hannah at school coloring suns too big for the page. He thought of the garage of grease under his nails of the life that had kept him grounded. That night, he told her the truth in simple terms. "I might be doing different work," he said, tucking her in. "Will you still pick me up on Fridays?" she asked. "Yes." "Then it's okay," she said, already drifting. Weeks later, the task force began quietly. Daniel moved through facilities, agencies, departments that looked fine on paper and cracked under touch. He asked questions no one expected. He waded through uncomfortable silences. He learned which doors opened easily and which ones locked fast. Pushback came in subtle forms. Meetings canceled last minute, files delayed, smiles that never reached eyes. Then came the first direct threat. An anonymous envelope slid under his apartment door one evening. No return address. Inside was a printed photo of Hannah walking home from school, time-stamped from that afternoon. No note. No message. Daniel stared at it for a long time. He called Brooks. "This just crossed a line," he said. Her voice hardened. "Send me everything." Within hours, unmarked cars appeared on his street. Hannah noticed. "Are they friends?" "Yes," Daniel said. "They're here to help." The investigation accelerated after that. Subtlety gave way to clarity. Names surfaced. Patterns converged. A senior administrator resigned suddenly, citing health reasons. Another took extended leave. And then, inevitably, the media caught the scent. A reporter called Daniel's phone. He didn't answer. Another left a message. Then another. Headlines began to speculate. A shadow task force. A whistleblower without credentials. The pressure mounted. One evening, Daniel received a call from Robert Hale. "They're trying to isolate you," Hale said. "Turn this into a narrative about overreach." Daniel stared out the window at the quiet street. "They can try. They'll offer you something," Hale warned. "A position, a settlement, a way out." Daniel nodded. "I know." The offer came 2 days later, a meeting request from a senior corporate lobbyist. Private location, no record. Daniel declined. That refusal triggered the backlash. Funding streams were questioned, jurisdiction challenged, motions filed to dissolve the task force. Brooks called him late that night. "They're forcing a public reckoning," she said. "Are you ready?" Daniel looked at Hannah's drawing, now framed on the wall. "I've been underestimated my whole life." The hearing was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. Daniel sat at a long table facing a panel of officials and legislators. Cameras lined the back wall. Microphones blinked red. The room buzzed with anticipation. A man in an expensive suit leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Miller, you're not an engineer. You're not an attorney. On what authority do you operate?" Daniel leaned forward. The room quieted. "On the authority of outcomes," he said. "When systems fail, people pay the price." I was asked to find out why. I did. Another voice cut in. "You've disrupted established processes." Daniel nodded. "Because they were protecting themselves." A murmur spread. "Do you deny that your actions have caused economic instability?" someone asked. Daniel met the panel's gaze, one face at a time. "I deny that accountability causes instability. Negligence does. The cameras caught it all. The stillness. The certainty. Outside, crowds gathered, some angry, some curious, some quietly supportive. Daniel didn't see them. He was already thinking ahead. Because he knew something they didn't. This wasn't the climax. It was the moment the room realized the wrong man had been ignored, and the cost of that mistake was about to be paid by people who had always assumed someone else would take the fall. The hearing ended without applause, without resolution, and without mercy. Daniel walked out through a side corridor while cameras clustered at the front steps shouting questions that bounced uselessly off the stone walls. He did not slow down. He had learned that momentum was a kind of shield. By nightfall, the story had a name. An oversight mechanic. A shadow investigator. A nobody who reached too far. Daniel watched none of it. He cooked dinner, helped Hannah with spelling words, and checked the locks twice before bed. The city outside felt closer now, its sounds sharper like glass underfoot. At 2:12 in the morning, his phone vibrated. Not rang. Vibrated. A signal he had agreed to answer no matter what. Brooks's number. "They filed an injunction," she said. "They're trying to suspend the task force pending review." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. On what grounds? Jurisdiction? Authority? Procedural overreach? A breath? And a sealed affidavit. Daniel closed his eyes. From who we don't know yet, but it's personal. He pictured the photo in the envelope, Hannah's ponytail, the timestamp. "What do you need from me?" "Be ready," Brooks said. "And don't move tonight." At dawn, the knock came. Not loud, precise. Daniel opened the door to find two federal marshals' faces, calm hands visible. Behind them, a woman in a gray coat held a tablet. "Mr. Miller," she said, "we need you to come with us." Daniel nodded. He kissed Hannah's forehead, whispered that Mrs. Carson would walk her to school, and followed them without resistance. He had expected this. When you pull at threads long enough, someone always tugs back. The building they brought him to was unremarkable. Concrete, fluorescent lights, a conference room that smelled faintly of cleaning solvent. Brooks was already there, jaw set. Across from her sat three men Daniel had not met. Suits, pins, eyes trained to keep their emotions quiet. "This is a closed session," one of them said. "No recordings." Daniel sat. "Then say it plainly." The man slid a folder forward. Inside was a statement alleging misuse of authority, selective reporting, and endangerment of operations. At the bottom was a signature. A name Daniel recognized. The younger executive from the boardroom. Restless smile, dead eyes. "They're claiming you falsified findings," the man said. Daniel didn't touch the folder. "They're lying." "We know," Brooks said sharply. "But they only need delay." Another man leaned in. "If the injunction holds, everything you uncovered gets buried in review. Years of it." Daniel felt the weight settle. This was the corner. "What's the alternative?" Silence stretched. Then Brooks spoke carefully. "There is a mechanism, rarely used. risky. It would move the review outside the agencies involved. Daniel looked at her. Who triggers it? She met his gaze. You. He shook his head. I don't have standing. One of the men across the table smiled thinly. You do if you're willing to be named. Daniel understood then. Not a consultant, not an investigator, a witness. Public. Exposed. They'll come for my family, he said quietly. Brooks didn't argue. They already did. He stood and paced once, twice. The room felt smaller with each step. He thought of the garage, of Frank's warning not to let it change him, of Whitman's quiet nod, of Hannah asking if he would still pick her up on Fridays. I'll do it, Daniel said. On one condition. Name it, the man said. Everything goes on record, Daniel replied. No redactions that hide culpability. If I'm going to stand in front of this, it ends. They exchanged looks. Then one nodded. Agreed. The press conference was scheduled for the afternoon. Daniel stood behind the podium, lights hot on his face, cameras stacked like watchful eyes. He felt oddly calm. Fear had burned off hours ago, leaving something harder in its place. Brooks stood to his right. Whitman, invited as an observer, stood at the back, expression grave. Daniel spoke without notes. I was asked to look where others didn't, he said. I didn't go looking for power. I went looking for truth. A reporter shouted a question. Another followed. Daniel raised a hand. The room quieted. People assume systems fail because of bad luck, he continued. They don't. They fail because people learn where no one is watching. He described patterns, incentives, emails, decisions made far from consequences. He did not name names at first. He let the structure reveal itself. Then he named them. The room shifted. A collective intake of breath. Phones lit up. A reporter asked, "Why you?" Daniel paused. The question deserved honesty. Because I was overlooked, he said. And I stayed that way long enough to see clearly. The injunction was lifted before sunset. By nightfall, resignations rolled in. Not statements. Departures. Quiet. Effective. The sealed affidavit was withdrawn. The executive's lawyer cited misunderstanding. No one believed him. Daniel returned home exhausted. Hannah ran to him, arms tight around his waist. You're on TV, she said, half excited, half scared. He knelt. I know. Are you in trouble? He chose his words carefully. I'm doing something hard. But it's right. She nodded, accepting it with the simple faith of a child who trusts the person in front of her more than the noise beyond the door. Later, after she slept, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. The phone buzzed again. Hale. You just changed the rules, Hale said. Daniel looked at the dark window. They needed changing. They'll offer you protection now, Hale warned. Status. Permanence. Daniel shook his head, though Hale couldn't see it. I didn't do this to become untouchable. What did you do it for? Hale asked. Daniel thought of a storm on a highway, 2 figures in the rain, a choice to stop. So no one else has to be invisible to matter, he said. Outside the city hummed restless and awake. Somewhere deep within its machinery, gears were grinding into new alignment. Daniel Miller did not know what came next. He only knew he would not step aside. Not now. Not ever. The morning after the press conference, the city felt quieter, like it was waiting to see which direction the ground would tilt. Daniel noticed it on the drive to school. Fewer horns. More people standing still at crosswalks, phones in hand, reading headlines that no longer felt distant. At the drop-off, Hannah squeezed his hand longer than usual. You'll be there, she said. Not a question. I'll be there, Daniel replied. She nodded satisfied and ran toward the doors. Daniel watched until she disappeared inside before pulling away. Only then did his phone begin to ring. The offers came first. Quiet, polished calls from people who spoke as if they had always known him. Advisory roles, permanent appointments, security details, a title that would put distance between him and consequences. Daniel declined each one with the same sentence. "I'm not done yet." By mid-morning, the tone shifted. A voicemail from a man who did not introduce himself warned that Daniel was confusing momentum with immunity. An email arrived accusing him of violating confidentiality agreements he had never signed. A social media account bearing his name appeared and began posting statements he had not made. Discredit was cheaper than defense. Brooks called just after noon. "They're regrouping," she said. "This is the messy part." Daniel parked outside the garage. He had not been there in weeks. The sign still hung crooked. The door still rattled when it opened. Frank looked up from under a hood and froze. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank said. "They let you out of the fancy rooms?" Daniel smiled. "I missed the noise." Frank wiped his hands. "People been asking about you." "Good things," Frank snorted. "Depends who's asking." They stood for a moment, surrounded by familiar smells and sounds. Ground truth. Daniel needed that. "I'm thinking of stepping back," Daniel said finally. Frank raised an eyebrow. "From what?" "From all of it. Letting the systems do what they're supposed to do." Frank leaned against the tool chest. "You believe that Daniel didn't answer." That evening, Daniel met Whitman at the same coffee shop as before. The judge looked older, or maybe just relieved. "You didn't have to keep going," Whitman said. Daniel wrapped his hands around the mug. "Neither did you," Whitman nodded. "True. And yet here we are." They sat in silence for a while. Then Whitman spoke. "They're offering you a seat." Daniel looked up. "I know." Whitman met his gaze. "Power doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It asks what you're willing to trade." Daniel exhaled. "I don't want to become the thing I'm fighting." Whitman smiled faintly. "Then don't." That night, Daniel found the envelope taped to his door. No photo this time, just a folded page. Inside was a printed transcript of a meeting he had never attended but recognized instantly. His words, twisted, rearranged, weaponized. At the bottom, a note. "Stand down, or this goes everywhere." Daniel sat at the table long after Hannah went to bed, the paper untouched in front of him. Fear tried to find a foothold and failed. He was past that now. What remained was choice. He called Brooks. "They're threatening me," he said. "I know," she replied. "They've been threatening everyone." "I'm not stepping back," Daniel said. "But I'm not stepping up the way they expect either." Brooks was quiet. "What are you thinking?" "I want it open," Daniel said. "All of it. Not a task force, not an appointment, a record, a trail no one controls." "That will burn bridges," Brooks warned. Daniel looked at Hannah's drawing on the fridge. The sun was still too big for the page. Then they shouldn't have been built on silence. By morning, Daniel released everything he could legally release. Timelines, methodologies, redacted documents that showed patterns without exposing the vulnerable. He published it quietly without commentary through channels that valued accuracy over speed. The response was immediate and uneven. Some called it reckless, others called it overdue. Independent groups began to corroborate. University researchers reached out. Journalists who had once ignored him now asked careful questions. The narrative fractured, which was exactly the point. A week later, Daniel testified again, this time without cameras. A closed-door session. Senators, inspectors, people who understood the weight of evidence even if they did not like its implications. When it ended, a woman with silver hair and tired eyes approached him. "You didn't take the seat," she said. Daniel nodded. "I took the responsibility." She studied him. "You've made enemies." "I had those already," Daniel replied. At home, Hannah sensed the shift before he said anything. "Are you going to stop now?" she asked one night. Daniel sat beside her. "I'm going to change how I do it." She considered that. "Like when you fixed the sink, but didn't break the wall." He laughed softly. "Exactly like that." The calls slowed. The threats faded into legal language and procedural delays. Systems adapted. Some resisted. Some learned. Daniel returned to the garage full-time. He took the day shift, trained apprentices, paid attention to the quiet things. Once a month he spoke with oversight groups who asked him to explain how to see what people missed. He never raised his voice. One afternoon, Hale showed up unannounced. "You turned down everything Hale said." Daniel shrugged. "I kept what mattered." Hale studied him. "You could have changed everything." Daniel met his gaze. "I did." As Hale left, Daniel watched the door close and felt something settle into place. Not triumph. Alignment. That evening, Daniel walked Hannah home from school. The sun was low, casting long shadows. A man at the corner nodded at him. Recognition without intrusion. Hannah skipped ahead, then turned. "Daddy." "Yeah. Are we okay now?" Daniel looked down the street. Ordinary houses, ordinary lives, fragile, resilient, worth protecting. "Yes," he said, "we are." And for the first time since the storm, he believed it. The storm returned a year later almost to the day, but this time Daniel noticed it from his kitchen window instead of a highway shoulder. Rain streaked down the glass in heavy lines, blurring the streetlights into soft halos. Hannah sat at the table doing homework, humming quietly, her pencil tapping in a steady rhythm. The sound anchored him. Ordinary. Solid. Earned. Daniel's life no longer moved at the speed of crisis. It moved with intention. The garage still opened at 7 every morning. The smell of oil and metal still clung to his jacket. He still trained apprentices who reminded him of himself, young men who thought strength meant endurance, and learned slowly that it also meant care. The difference now was not status or recognition. It was clarity. He knew exactly where he stood and why. The systems he had exposed did not collapse overnight. They never did. Instead, they shifted. Quiet reforms, revised oversight language, independent audits that no longer reported to themselves. It wasn't justice delivered with a gavel. It was justice installed like infrastructure, slow and unglamorous, meant to last longer than any headline. Daniel preferred it that way. He never became untouchable. He never wanted to be. What he became instead was difficult to ignore. That was enough. On Friday afternoons, he still picked Hannah up from school, still waited by the same curb, still waved at the same crossing guard, who now nodded back with a little more respect. Hannah talked about spelling tests, friends, the piano lessons Daniel had finally managed to afford without guilt. She laughed easily now, slept through the night. The fear that once lived behind her eyes had faded into memory. Sometimes after dinner they walked together through the neighborhood, past houses like theirs, past families with stories no one saw from the outside. Daniel understood something now that he hadn't before. Most people weren't bad. They were tired, and tired people relied on systems to carry weight they could not. When those systems failed, the damage didn't make the news. It made scars. One evening, a letter arrived without warning. No threat, no seal, just a plain envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman Daniel didn't know. She wrote about a bus route that had been repaired, about her son who now got to school safely, about never knowing who to thank but wanting someone to know it mattered. Daniel folded the letter and placed it in a drawer where he kept others like it. He didn't reread them often. He didn't need to. Judge Whitman visited once more before retiring. They shared coffee on the porch while Hannah played inside. Whitman looked lighter now, unburdened by a role that had once defined him too tightly. He spoke about his daughters, about dinners he no longer missed, about learning too late, and deciding not to waste what remained. Daniel listened the way he always had, without judgment, without expectation. When Whitman left, he shook Daniel's hand and said nothing profound. He didn't need to. Some acknowledgments were better left unspoken. The rain outside slowed. The storm moved on, leaving the street washed clean. Hannah looked up from her homework. "Daddy," she said when it was scary before, "did you know it would turn out okay?" Daniel considered the question carefully, then shook his head. "No, I just knew what I had to do." She smiled and went back to her work, satisfied with the answer. Later, when the house was quiet, Daniel stood in the doorway of her room and watched her sleep. The stuffed elephant tucked under her arm, the steady rise and fall of her chest. This was the measure of everything. Not the rooms he'd sat in, not the people who'd tried to stop him. This. The world outside would keep turning. Systems would strain. People would fail and try again. Daniel Miller would still wake early, still work with his hands, still stop when others kept driving. Not because anyone was watching, but because someone always was somewhere depending on it. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that quiet choices still shape the world we live in, take a moment to like this story, subscribe for more, and leave a comment below with these 3 words: kindness still matters.